It was supposed to be a quiet Saturday. You know those rare moments when everything feels in its place? The sun was shining, the birds were singing, and the smell of fresh coffee filled the house. My wife, Emily, had left early for one of those Costco runs that every suburban household knows too well. You go in for a loaf of bread, and somehow, you leave with enough bottled water to supply a small army, and toilet paper in bulk as if you're preparing for an apocalypse. I had no idea that this day, like any other, was going to spiral into something completely absurd. I was still half awake when I heard the familiar rumble of our SUV pulling into the driveway. It was almost like a ritual, that sound of tires on gravel. I looked out the window and saw Emily struggling with an avalanche of groceries, cases of bottled water, boxes of frozen food, and enough paper towels to last us a lifetime. I smiled to myself, knowing we'd be well stocked for whatever life threw our way. She was unloading it all into our driveway, not blocking anyone, just in the place where our car was meant to go. But then, from the corner of my eye, I saw her. Marcia. The HOA president. We'd only met her once at the neighborhood welcome session, and at the time, I found her odd, but harmless. Little did I know, she was about to become a thorn in our side. I saw her marching across the street toward our driveway, clipboard in hand, her steps purposeful and stiff, like she had something to prove. Her eyes were locked on Emily, and I could tell by the way she was staring that this was not a friendly neighborhood check-in. I felt a pit in my stomach. The peaceful Saturday morning I'd been enjoying was about to come to an abrupt halt. Marcia stopped just a few feet from Emily, her arms crossed, her expression that of someone who just discovered a massive violation of some unspoken rule. The kind of rule that no one talks about, but everyone is supposed to obey. "Excuse me," she said, her voice dripping with authority. "What exactly are you doing?" Emily, ever the diplomat, looked up from her task. "Hi there, just unloading groceries," she replied with that friendly tone that always made me proud. But Marcia wasn't having it. "Your vehicle is in violation of parking regulations," she said, her gaze never leaving Emily. "You can't block traffic like this." I was still standing by the window, incredulous. Our SUV was parked entirely in our own driveway, not blocking anyone's view, not impeding any traffic flow. The street was clear, the sidewalks wide open. There was nothing that even remotely resembled a traffic obstruction. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Emily, to her credit, stayed calm. "I'm not blocking any traffic. I'm parked in my own driveway to unload groceries." She gestured to the open street. "As you can see, there's plenty of room." But Marcia wasn't backing down. "I'm going to report this violation," she said, her tone cold and final. Emily, ever so graceful, just shrugged and returned to unloading the rest of our supplies. "Do whatever you think is appropriate," she said, and I could tell she was already tired of this absurdity. I thought that would be the end of it. Maybe Marcia would send a sternly worded email to the HOA board, or maybe, just maybe, she'd find something else to occupy her time. But I had no idea what was about to unfold. After half an hour, we were back to our peaceful routine, laughing at the ridiculousness of the whole situation. And then, out of nowhere, I heard it. The faint wail of sirens. It was distant at first, so distant I thought I might have imagined it. But it grew louder, and soon it was right outside our house. That's when I realized something was wrong. The sheriff's patrol car stopped in front of our driveway. A deputy stepped out, looking around like he was on a search for something serious. This was no mistake. This wasn't a misunderstanding. A sheriff had arrived at our door, and I knew that somehow, this absurd grocery unloading incident had turned into something far more dramatic. I called to Emily, who was still inside, putting the last of the groceries away. "Honey, there's a sheriff at the door," I said, my voice tinged with confusion. She came rushing out, her expression matching my own confusion. What in the world was going on? Why was law enforcement involved in this? And that, my friends, is where the real chaos began. I opened the door, still in disbelief, and found the deputy standing there with his notepad out. He looked professional, no signs of panic or urgency, but I could tell this was no routine check. His name tag read Martinez. He glanced at me, then at Emily, and back at the quiet street, like he was trying to make sense of the situation. "Good morning, sir," he said, in that calm, methodical voice that police officers use when they're about to explain something that doesn't quite add up. "I received a report about a public disturbance and a traffic obstruction at this address." A public disturbance? Traffic obstruction? My mind raced, trying to piece together how unloading groceries could lead to such an absurd response. I stood there for a moment, trying to comprehend what he was saying. Public disturbance? We'd just spent the morning peacefully restocking our pantry. Emily had been unloading cases of bottled water and frozen food, not staging a protest. What kind of disturbance could this possibly be? I forced myself to focus and replied, "Officer, I think you've got the wrong address. We were just unloading groceries." The deputy, probably trying to maintain the professional demeanor expected of him, looked around our property. Our driveway was empty, save for some empty cardboard boxes that we hadn't taken to the recycling bin yet. There was no sign of a disturbance, no traffic obstruction, nothing that would even remotely warrant a sheriff's response. Deputy Martinez paused for a moment, then said, "I see a clear driveway. Where's the obstruction?" Emily, who had joined me at the door, nodded, her face a picture of polite confusion. "Our car has been in the garage for the past half hour, officer." "Who exactly called this in?" Martinez consulted his notes, then looked up. "A Mrs. Marcia Wilkins reported a public safety issue." It hit me like a punch to the gut. Marcia. Of course, it was her. She was the HOA president. She was the one who had taken issue with Emily unloading groceries. She had somehow managed to turn a simple Saturday chore into a full-blown emergency. I couldn't believe it. I stood there, processing the absurdity of it all. Marcia, who had been so quick to judge us for nothing more than unloading groceries, had now called 911 on us. I wondered if she'd ever imagined how far this would go, how she would become the antagonist in her own drama. Deputy Martinez, still calm and polite, continued. "I have to follow up on 911 calls, sir. It's standard procedure." I sighed, feeling a rush of frustration. "This is insane, officer. We were just unloading groceries. There was no violation." Emily, her voice a bit more clipped now, asked, "Is this really necessary? Are we being fined or arrested for unloading toilet paper?" Martinez looked at us, taking in the ridiculousness of the situation. He was clearly starting to piece it together. His voice softened. "No, ma'am. This is just a follow-up. But I do need to verify your identities and complete my report." I nodded, feeling a mix of disbelief and confusion. "Go ahead," I said, my voice tight. Emily pulled out her ID, and I watched as Martinez took it, glancing at it quickly. But then, something in his posture shifted. It was subtle, but it was there. His eyes widened, and he took a step back, almost like he had just realized he wasn't dealing with an ordinary homeowner. "FBI?" he muttered under his breath, his voice trailing off as he glanced at Emily, then at the ID card again. "Counterterrorism?" Emily didn't flinch. She didn't react. She was already well versed in handling situations like this. But I could feel the shift in the air. The officer, who had just been doing his job, suddenly realized that he had made a mistake. And not just any mistake, he had called in backup over a completely unjustified 911 call. The deputy's entire demeanor changed. He stood straighter, almost as if saluting, though it wasn't quite that dramatic. But I could see the shift, the respect, the professionalism. It was as if the weight of the situation had fully landed on him. "Ma'am, I think there's been a serious misunderstanding here," he said, his tone now more respectful than it had been just moments ago. I could almost feel the tension evaporating as Martinez apologized, offering a quiet explanation that he would be filing a report about the misuse of emergency services. I looked at Emily, who nodded calmly, her professional mask firmly in place. It was clear she wasn't rattled, but I could feel the knot in my stomach loosen. As the deputy got back in his car and drove away, I realized the extent of the situation. Marcia had gone way too far, and now, her actions were causing a ripple effect that was reaching further than she could have ever imagined. The silence that followed was eerie. The weight of the situation hung in the air. It wasn't just about groceries anymore, it was about something much bigger. The HOA, the community, the rules they followed, it all felt like one giant web of control, and we had just stumbled into the center of it. I looked over at Emily. She was calm, collected, but I could see the wheels turning in her head. This wasn't just about the ridiculousness of Marcia's actions anymore. Something told me this was only the beginning of a much larger fight. The morning had settled into a strange quietness after the deputy's visit. I thought, perhaps naively, that the worst of it was behind us. I figured Marcia, having seen the error of her ways, would retreat into the shadows, licking her wounds and finding a more reasonable target to attack. But I was wrong. Far from retreating, Marcia seemed to double down, as if she couldn't stand the idea of being proven wrong. And as if on cue, the next chapter of this absurd saga began when an envelope showed up in our mailbox. I was working from home that afternoon when I heard the familiar sound of the mailbox closing. A little, familiar thunk that should have meant nothing. But when I saw the thick envelope in my hand, I felt a chill creep down my spine. The bold red letters on the front screamed, "Legal notice," in a way that made my stomach drop. I knew, instantly, that this wasn't just some misplaced misunderstanding anymore. Marcia was coming for us, again. I called Emily over, holding the envelope up like it might bite me. "You've got to see this," I muttered, my voice already laced with dread. We sat down at the kitchen table, and I ripped open the envelope, finding a professionally printed letter. The weight of it made the whole situation feel even more real. I couldn't help but feel the surge of anxiety in my chest. I thought back to what had just happened, the sheriff, the absurdity of the 911 call, and now this. Was this really happening? Were we really about to fight for our basic right to exist in our own home, in our own driveway? At the top of the letter, in bold, terrifying letters, was the heading, "Final Notice Violation Fee, $500. Beneath that was the list of alleged offenses. Failure to comply with traffic flow regulations, and disregard for neighborhood safety protocol. I was stunned. $500. For what? Unloading groceries in our own driveway? The absurdity of it hit me all over again, but this time, there was a bitter weight behind it. A feeling that this wasn't just about the fine, it was about Marcia's need to control everything. Emily glanced at the letter, her face a study in cool professionalism. But I could see the tiny twitch in her jaw, the tension she was holding back. $500, that wasn't pocket change. It was a serious amount of money, especially when we had done absolutely nothing wrong. I felt the tightness in my chest growing as I considered the possibility of just paying the fine, of giving in to the unreasonable demands of someone who thought they had the power to dictate every aspect of our lives. "It's less than hiring a lawyer to fight it," I suggested, trying to justify it to myself. I thought about how much simpler it would be to pay and move on, to get this ridiculous matter out of our lives. But Emily wasn't having it. She gave me that look. The one that meant she wasn't going to let this slide. "We're not paying for something we didn't do wrong," she said, her voice calm but determined. That was when I knew she wasn't just upset, she was ready to fight. The fight for our right to exist in peace had just begun. Without another word, Emily pulled out the HOA rulebook, the thick, archaic binder we had received when we moved into the neighborhood. She flipped through it like she was dissecting a legal case, going through clause after clause, looking for the loopholes, the inconsistencies. And as she flipped through, I began to see what I hadn't before. This wasn't just about us unloading groceries in our own driveway. This was about a person, Marcia, who had too much power for too long and had gotten used to pushing people around without consequence. After a solid hour of combing through the rules, Emily found it. Violation notices, according to the bylaws, had to be signed by at least 3 board members. Photographic evidence had to be included to substantiate the claim, and there needed to be witness statements confirming that an actual violation had occurred. We had none of that. This wasn't just a case of being unfair, this was a case of outright invalid accusations. With a deep breath, Emily looked up from the rulebook. "This letter has no legal authority," she said, her voice full of quiet confidence. I felt a surge of relief wash over me. It wasn't just a matter of principle anymore, it was a matter of facts, and the facts were on our side. Marcia had violated every rule in the HOA's own handbook. The letter she had sent was nothing more than a piece of paper with her personal vendetta against us, printed on expensive letterhead. Emily's fingers hovered over the keyboard as she began drafting our response. The words came easy to her, and I watched as she carefully constructed each sentence, polite, professional, but unyielding. "We respectfully request documentation for the alleged violation, including photographic evidence, witness statements, and proper board authorization, as required by the HOA bylaws." She included a reminder, though, that wasn't quite as polite: misuse of emergency services carries legal consequences under state law. As she signed the letter, I could see that there was no turning back now. Emily wasn't going to let this go. And I, for one, was right there with her. Once the letter was ready, we mailed it, certified, to ensure that Marcia would have to sign for it. It wasn't just a response anymore. It was a statement. A declaration that we weren't going to sit back and let this kind of behavior slide. But as we sent the letter off, a nagging thought lingered in the back of my mind. What would Marcia do next? It wasn't over, I knew. I could feel it in my bones. 2 days passed, and for a while, I thought that perhaps the storm had passed. Emily and I had even joked about how our little HOA drama would soon be forgotten, just another absurdity that would fade into the background of our lives. But we were wrong. Marcia was like a hurricane, and we had no idea how much more damage she could cause. I had just finished my workday when Emily's phone buzzed. I looked over at her, my heart already sinking, because I knew it was more bad news. Emily picked up the phone, and as she listened, her face went from curious to concerned in the blink of an eye. "It's Brenda Chen," she said softly, her voice tinged with unease. Brenda was the HOA secretary, and she'd always struck me as reasonable. If anyone could rein in Marcia's overreach, it was her. But as Emily listened to Brenda's voice on the other end, I could see that something had shifted. The words Brenda spoke were more ominous than anything I'd heard so far. "An emergency HOA meeting?" Emily repeated, disbelief written all over her face. She glanced up at me. "It's scheduled for Tuesday night. Brenda says they're calling it to address some community safety concerns and compliance issues." I stared at her, trying to wrap my mind around it. Community safety concerns? We hadn't done anything wrong. We were just unloading groceries. What safety threat could possibly be tied to that? But I could already see the pieces falling into place. Marcia. The next few days felt like a waiting game. I was more on edge than I cared to admit. The idea of walking into an emergency meeting where we were suddenly the problem was unnerving. Emily had never backed down from a fight before, but something about the whole situation felt like we were being cornered in a way we hadn't anticipated. By the time Tuesday evening rolled around, I could feel the tension in the air. The meeting wasn't just about some petty violation anymore. It had become a full-on battle of wills. The crowd in the community center was unnervingly large for an HOA meeting, there had to be at least 20 people. Normally, these things attracted maybe 8 or 10 retirees who attended because they were bored or just out of civic duty. Tonight, however, the room was filled with people I didn't recognize. And I could feel the judgment in the air, the whispers and sideways glances as if everyone had already picked sides. The moment we walked in, I knew it wasn't just about us anymore. It was a spectacle. A trial. A game where Marcia had already decided we were guilty of something, and now it was her turn to put us on trial. Marcia was at the front, of course, confident as ever, her clipboard clutched like a shield, her eyes scanning the room. She didn't even look at Emily as we walked in, but I could feel the heat of her gaze, the kind of look that says, "I'm not finished with you yet." I took my seat next to Emily, who, as always, was the picture of calm. But even she was tense now. There was no denying it. This wasn't just about the violation anymore. It was personal. It was about power, control, and the lengths to which Marcia would go to maintain both. The meeting started with Brenda going over the usual HOA updates, but it didn't take long for Marcia to cut in. Her voice was tight with barely contained frustration, her words dripping with self-righteousness. "I think it's time we address the issue of Emily and her vehicle," Marcia said, her eyes narrowing as she looked at us. She leaned forward, almost like she was daring us to challenge her. "This kind of aggressive parking behavior threatens the safety of our neighborhood. We can't allow people to think they can just block traffic and create dangerous situations. Our community is better than that." I felt my blood boil. Aggressive parking behavior? My mind was spinning, trying to keep up. Was she really this delusional? Was this her attempt at turning a simple mistake into a federal case? But Emily didn't flinch. She simply stood up, her voice steady but firm, as she addressed the room. "I'm a neighbor first. An agent second. My job has nothing to do with this neighborhood," she said, looking directly at Marcia. "I live here, and I've never used my position to intimidate anyone." Her words hung in the air, but it was clear not everyone in the room was convinced. There were a few murmurs from the crowd, unsure of what to believe. Marcia's supporters, few as they were, looked at us with suspicion, as if they had already decided we were guilty of something. That's when I knew Emily was right. This wasn't just about groceries anymore. It was about a power struggle that had been brewing for a while, and we had unknowingly become the target of it. But then, just when I thought things couldn't get any worse, Marcia made the mistake of bringing up something I wasn't prepared for. Her voice rang out with a venomous undertone as she announced, "We need to discuss the federal agent who's been surveilling our neighborhood." Surveilling? My chest tightened. It was a blow that hit harder than I could have imagined. My heart pounded in my ears as I tried to process the weight of her words. She was framing Emily's position as a federal agent as a threat to our community's safety. Suddenly, everything changed. This wasn't about groceries anymore. Marcia was painting Emily as some kind of intruder, a spy in our midst. The room went silent. It was like everyone was waiting for the bombshell to drop. And when it did, it landed with a thud, shaking the very foundation of our community. The people who had once greeted us warmly now looked at us with distrust. The feeling in the room shifted, and I realized we weren't just fighting Marcia anymore. We were fighting a narrative that she was weaving, a narrative where we were the outsiders. And that's when it hit me. This wasn't going to be easy. Marcia wasn't about to let go of her power quietly. She wasn't going to back down just because the facts were on our side. She was going to escalate. And we were in for a fight that was about to get a lot messier. As the meeting went on, I felt like I was trapped in a surreal version of reality. Marcia's words hung in the air, twisting the entire situation into something sinister and beyond the realm of reason. She had made it clear, whether out of personal vendetta or sheer stubbornness, that she wasn't going to back down. Emily and I had just become pawns in her need for control. But as the meeting dragged on, it became increasingly apparent that Marcia wasn't the only one in the room with a stake in this. While there were a few neighbors who seemed to side with her, there were others who had begun to notice something disturbing about the way she was handling things. It was as if a quiet realization was dawning on them. This wasn't just a simple dispute over parking, this was about one person abusing her authority and creating chaos in a community that had once been peaceful. I could see the murmurs spreading. People were starting to notice the cracks in Marcia's story. They were beginning to see what we saw. This wasn't about safety. It was about control. And then Emily, calm and composed as ever, did something I didn't expect. She stood up again, her posture straight and unwavering. Her voice rang out clearly and evenly, cutting through the tension in the room like a blade. "I don't want to make this personal," she began, her eyes scanning the room, meeting the eyes of every person present. "But the fact is, my job, my position, has nothing to do with how I live here. I'm just a neighbor, just like everyone else. I haven't used my position to intimidate anyone, and I certainly haven't caused a threat to this community." The sincerity in her words was undeniable. Emily wasn't defensive, she wasn't trying to justify herself. She simply told the truth, something that was beginning to feel rare in this room. But as she spoke, I saw it. The turning point. The people who had been on the fence, who had been unsure about what to believe, were starting to shift. A few people nodded, their faces showing signs of recognition. Maybe they had been skeptical at first. Maybe they had listened to Marcia's claims about federal agents and safety threats. But now, they saw Emily for what she was, a neighbor, just like them, who had been dragged into this mess by someone far more concerned with power than with anything resembling community. The realization hit me like a jolt. We weren't alone in this fight anymore. And then Arthur Davies, that one neighbor who was always in the know about every HOA rule, stood up. Arthur had been an ally since the moment we met him. He was the guy who knew all the ins and outs of the community bylaws. He had been through his own battles with the HOA before and had learned how to play their game. But what he did next was nothing short of genius. Arthur raised his hand, his calm voice cutting through the noise like it was nothing. "Let's talk about what actually violates community policies," he said. There was an air of authority in his voice, like he had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in his head. "The HOA charter is clear," Arthur continued, looking directly at Marcia. Section 4.2 clearly states that emergency service calls must be pre-approved by at least 2 board members, except in actual life-threatening situations. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "And I'm pretty sure that unloading groceries doesn't qualify as a life-threatening situation." I saw the room shift again. The tide was turning. Marcia's face, once flushed with the confidence of authority, began to tighten. Her hands gripped her clipboard even harder, her knuckles white. She was cornered, and she knew it. Arthur had just dismantled her entire argument. There were gasps from the crowd as Arthur continued. "Marcia, you know the rules. You wrote them. You were part of the board when they were created. And you broke those rules by calling 911 without the proper approval." It was a moment of pure power. Arthur didn't just challenge Marcia's authority, he showed the entire room that she had violated her own policies. He had found the chink in her armor, and now everyone could see it. Marcia, in her desperate attempt to maintain control, had overplayed her hand. But Marcia wasn't done yet. She tried to wave Arthur's argument away. "This is just a technicality," she snapped. "I saw a threat to the community, and I acted. It doesn't matter what the rules say." That's when Emily stepped in. "What threat?" she asked, her voice cutting through Marcia's excuses. "Toilet paper? Frozen food? What exactly were you seeing that you believed was a danger to anyone?" It was a question that hung in the air like a challenge. Marcia's face reddened, her lips pressed into a thin line as she fumbled for an answer. But the truth was, there was no answer. There had been no threat, no danger. Emily and I had done nothing more than unload groceries, and Marcia had twisted that into something it was never meant to be. But the crowd was already turning. The few people who had still supported her were now shifting uncomfortably in their seats. The whispers were growing louder, and I could feel the weight of the room pressing down on Marcia. She was losing control, and the more she tried to defend her actions, the more transparent it became. And then, Emily dropped the bombshell. "I requested the 911 call," she said, her voice steady and sure. "I filed a formal public records request. I have the recording of the call right here." I thought Marcia was going to pass out. The color drained from her face as Emily held up a small USB drive. "I think everyone in this room should hear exactly what was said when the call was made." The room went still. Brenda, who had been quietly observing, took the drive and plugged it into the community center's sound system. The room was thick with anticipation, the air so quiet you could hear a pin drop. Then the recording started. Marcia's voice, shrill and filled with a strange sense of urgency, came through the speakers. "Yes, I need to report a major violation. There's a blue SUV blocking our community entrance. It looks like suspicious people unloading large packages. This could be a safety threat to our entire neighborhood." It was met with a collective gasp. The words hung in the air, and I could see the disbelief on the faces of the neighbors around us. Suspicious people. Safety threat from groceries. The absurdity of it all was too much for anyone to ignore. The entire room, once divided, now saw the truth. Marcia had called 911 over groceries. There was no denying it now. The recording made it impossible for Marcia to twist the narrative any longer. Her excuses crumbled under the weight of her own words. As I looked around the room, I saw heads shaking in disbelief. Murmurs of shock and frustration rippled through the crowd. People were finally starting to see the extent of what had happened. And they were angry. Emily didn't have to say anything else. The room had already spoken for her. And for the first time in what felt like a long, long battle, we had control of the situation. The tension in the room reached its peak after the recording played. Marcia's face, once full of determination, was now an open book of disbelief and regret. She was trapped in her own web of lies, and the truth was out there for everyone to hear. The entire community had just witnessed her overreach, and there was no hiding from the facts anymore. As the sound of Marcia's voice echoed through the speakers, a few of the board members began to shift uncomfortably. They couldn't ignore it any longer. Marcia had clearly overstepped her bounds. The whispers grew louder, and for the first time since this whole ordeal began, I saw Marcia's supporters waver. No one could justify what had just happened. Calling 911 over a simple household task. It was nothing short of absurd. But even as the weight of the situation settled in, Marcia didn't give up. She clutched her clipboard like it was a lifeline, her fingers gripping it with white-knuckled intensity. She tried to speak, but the words caught in her throat. There was no defending herself now. Every move she made only seemed to dig her deeper into the hole she had created. Arthur, sensing the finality of the moment, stood up once again. "Marcia," he said, his voice cutting through her feeble attempts at damage control. "You've made a mockery of the HOA's authority. You've misused emergency services, abused your power, and now, you're trying to turn this into something it's not. I think it's time we all move on from this." The room erupted into murmurs of agreement. No one was backing her anymore. The tide had fully turned, and Marcia's grip on the HOA was slipping fast. Within moments, a motion was made to suspend Marcia from her position. It was seconded quickly, and before she could even protest, the vote was called. Marcia had been dethroned, her reign over the HOA finally coming to an end. The very thing she had fought so hard to protect, the power she had wielded over the neighborhood, had unraveled in front of her eyes. As Marcia sat there in stunned silence, I felt a strange mix of satisfaction and relief. The battle was over. We had fought for what was right, and the community had rallied behind us. But there was still something bittersweet about it all. Marcia had been so determined to hold on to her power, to control every little detail of everyone's lives. But in the end, it wasn't her authority that won, it was the truth. But even as the meeting came to a close and the community began to move on, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't truly over. People like Marcia don't go down quietly. They don't just give up. And sure enough, just a few days later, the envelope arrived. This time, it wasn't from the HOA. It was a legal notice, informing us that Marcia was filing an appeal against her suspension. She wasn't going down without a fight. But this time, it was different. The community had seen what kind of person she was, and they weren't going to let her turn this into something it wasn't. The entire ordeal ended up costing Marcia more than she had bargained for. The appeal was thrown out, and she was forced to pay hefty fines for her misuse of emergency services. Her reputation, which she had spent years building, was tarnished beyond repair. People started to avoid her, the whispers following her wherever she went. It was clear she was no longer welcome in the very community she had tried so hard to control. Months passed. Life slowly returned to normal, but the events of that chaotic time lingered in my mind. Emily and I had come through it stronger, united by the ridiculousness of it all. And as I sat on our porch one evening, sipping a cold drink and watching the sunset, I realized something: it wasn't just about the groceries. It was about standing up for what's right. It was about not letting someone with power abuse it to control your life. It was about fighting for your peace, even when it seems like the world is against you. As for Marcia, she eventually sold her house and moved away. The house was bought by a young couple who greeted us with a friendly wave the first time they saw us unloading groceries. It felt like a quiet victory, a reminder that things always work out in the end, as long as you stay true to who you are. So, to everyone who's been through their own HOA drama or any kind of unreasonable power struggle, know that you're not alone. Stand up for yourself, and don't back down when you know you're in the right. You might just end up teaching the whole neighborhood a valuable lesson in accountability. And with that said, thanks for watching, and until next time.